We continue now at the top of Daf Kuf Tes Amid Beis and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 109b. On the previous Amid, the Gemara said that according to Rabbi Yoshua, in order for the Zrikas Hadam, the throwing of the blood, to be considered a good Zrika, there has to be a part of the carbon that's remaining, a kazayis of the carbon. And the Gemara brought a brisa to that effect, and the brisa now continues, O kazayis chelev, if there is a kazayis of chelev, of fat. Rashi says, O kazayis chelev, d'chsiv v'zorak ha-kohen es adam. It says that the Kohen throws the blood, v'hiktir ha-chelev, and he burns the chelev. Afal pi she'ein basar zorek olav es adam. Even if there isn't any meat, but if there's chelev, that also is sufficient to be zorek, to throw the blood. V'hachi mefarish b'menachos ba'akom etzraba. That's explained in Meseches menachos. So again, if there's that kazayis chelev, the kazayis basar, zorek es adam, then one can throw the blood. And the brisa continues, chatzi zayis basar, if there's a half a zayis, a half an olive size of meat, v'chatzi zayis chelev, and a half a zayis of chelev, so they do not combine, eino zorek es adam, then he cannot throw the blood. However, uva ola, when it comes to a carbon ola, where it's all burned on the mizbeach, so then they can combine chatzi zayis basar, v'chatzi zayis chelev, if there's a half a zayis of meat, and a half a zayis of chelev, zorek es adam, he is allowed to throw the blood then, mibnei shekula kolel, because again, when it comes to a carbon ola, it's all burned on the mizbeach. And the brisa concludes, uminchen, by a carbon mincha, afilu kula kayemes, even if it's all around, lo yizrok, he's not able to throw the blood. The Gemara asks, mincha maya avidita, by a carbon mincha, why is there any blood to be thrown at all? And the Gemara says, Amar Rapapa says, minchas nesachim haboim hazevach. We're talking here about a minchas nesachim, which is a mincha that comes along with libations, that comes with a carbon. And so the idea is, one might have thought that if the entire animal is no longer around, but the mincha is around, maybe that is sufficient. And again, we're saying that that is not sufficient. Rashi explains, what throwing of the blood is there by a carbon mincha? And the Gemara answered, minchas nesachim shaboim hazevach. We're talking about a minchas nesachim, which accompanies an animal carbon. V'avad besar hazevach, and the meat of the animal carbon, that's already been lost. V'hamincha kayemes, but the mincha is still around. Lo yizrok es adam b'shvila. That's not enough to be able to throw the blood. To lav gufa d'zvichi, because that's not the actual animal carbon, the actual animal sacrifice itself. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, hakometz v'halavona v'haktoras uminchas kohanim uminchas kohen mashiach uminchas nesachim. The kometz, again, the fistful of the carbon mincha. The lavon is the frankincense that accompanies the carbon mincha. The ketoris is the incense. Minchas kohanim is the mincha of kohanim, and the minchas kohen mashiach is the mincha of the kohen gadol, and the minchas nesachim is the mincha that accompanies the carbon with libations. Shehikriv me'achas mehen kezayis b'chutz. If from any of these a kezayis of them is offered outside of the Beis Hamikdash chayiv, then the individual is liable. Rabbi Lozer poter ad sheyakriv eskul, and Rabbi Lozer, some have the gears of Rabbi Eliezer, but it seems that the gears of Rabbi Lozer is correct. Rabbi Lozer exempts until the entire thing is offered, not just a kazayis. V'kulon shehikriv bifnim. Now, in all of these cases, if it was offered inside the Beis Hamikdash, v'shayir mehen kazayis, and a kazayis remained, v'hikrivo b'chutz, and that kazayis was offered outside the Beis Hamikdash, chayiv, then the individual is liable. V'kulon, and in all of these cases, shechosru kolshu, if they're missing something, if something is lost or destroyed, v'hikrivo b'chutz, and then it's offered outside the Beis Hamikdash pater, the person is exempt. And the Mishnah concludes, hamakriv kodshim ve'emurim, if somebody brings kodshim and their sacrificial portions b'chutz, outside of the Beis Hamikdash, chayiv, then the individual is liable. And Rashi explains, halavona, the frankincense, shel mincha, of a carbon mincha, as we said, v'haktoris, and the incense, shebechol yom pras shel shacharis, upras shel ben harbayim. This is the incense that was brought every single day. A pras, which is a half a mana, was brought in the morning, and a pras was brought in the afternoon. Shehiktir kezayis mehen b'chutz, so if a kezayis of that was burned outside the Beis Hamikdash, chayiv, then the individual is liable. And Kosavar, this Tana holds, kiksiv oso, when it's written in the pasuk the word oso, al hasholem hu chayiv eino chayiv al achoser, which means to say that a person is only chayiv if it's whole and not if it's missing. Now that could imply that you have to bring the whole thing outside of the Beis Hamikdash, not just a kezayis, but this Tana holds, no, you don't have to bring the whole thing. Ashir haktara ksiv, it's going on the minimum amount that is considered a haktara, considered a burning, v'hainu kezayis, and that's a kezayis. So when it says sholem, and according to this Tana, it doesn't mean to say that it has to literally be sholem, it just has to be the minimum shear, it has to be a kezayis. Again, that's the opinion of the Tana Kama. And Rashi continues, Rabbi Eliezer Nami, and Rabbi Eliezer also, here Rashi says Rabbi Eliezer, but some say it's a misprint again, it should be Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar also, midelo poligaresha, from the fact that he doesn't argue on the earlier Mishnah, again over here, Rabbi Elazar argues and says you have to bring the entire thing in order to be liable, you have to bring the entire thing outside of the Beis HaMikdash, but he doesn't say that in the earlier Mishnah Gabe Ola, he doesn't say that in the earlier Mishnah by Karban Ola. Hachanami darish le oso, ashir haktara karabanan, so he's going to darshan the word oso, just like the Rabbanan, he's going to say it just goes on the minimum amount that's considered a haktara. Umiu, and nevertheless, ola, when it comes to Karban Ola, the lo mifsala bechisaron, there you don't have the disqualification if it's missing. The chol atzma bedam tluya kaparasa, because there the entire kapara, the whole atonement is dependent upon the blood. So chayav bekazayis, that's why the person is liable by a kazayis, even according to Rebbe Elazar. Aval bahani polig, but in the cases in this Mishnah, Rebbe Elazar does argue to kasavar, because he holds kometz kule hainu shir haktaraso af bifnim, that the entire kometz is the minimum shir of burning, even bifnim, even inside the Beis HaMikdash. To hamifsal bechisaron, because over there, if something is missing, that is a disqualification. V'chein kulam, and that's true by all the cases in this Mishnah. Shakulam matir and all the cases in this Mishnah, they are matirim, they are permitters of the carbon. Calls man shalo karvu kulam, if the entire thing was not brought, lo have a haktar, it's not considered a proper burning. Lotzes bailim yedei chovasan, that the bailim can fulfill their obligation, and that's why Rabbi Elazar says it has to be yakrav as kulan outside the Beis HaMikdash for liability. Well, the Rabbanan, they argue in these cases in this Mishnah. Bahani nami have a haktarasan, because they hold that in these cases of this Mishnah, the haktar, it's considered haktar, even bekazayis, even if it's just that amount. Heichud dekule kaim, as long as the entire thing is intact, v'lo chasru kodem haktara, and it's not missing anything before the haktara. The Tanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, hiktir komtza pa'amayim, let's say the person burns the kometz, but he does it twice, he does it in steps, he doesn't do the whole thing at once. Kishera, that is kosher. Again, hilkach haktara, therefore it's considered a haktara, it's considered a proper burning. That's the machlokes in this Mishnah between the Tanakam and Rebbe Elazar. And then the Mishnah said, "V'kulan sheikrivan bifnim." In all of these cases, if it was offered inside, v'shayir mehen, and then a kazayis was remaining, which was offered outside, chayiv, the person is liable. Shaharei bazen nigmar haktarasan, because here everything was brought inside the Beis HaMikdash. It's only the last kazayis, the kazayis that's left. That is the conclusion of the burning of everything, and therefore everybody agrees if that's offered outside the Beis HaMikdash, one is chayiv. Well, the Rebbe Elazar nami, and according to Rebbe Elazar also, ki dorish oso ashir haktara dorish lei. He says the word oso is going on the minimum amount. V'shir haktara b'kazayis, and the minimum amount of haktara actually is a kazayis in this situation. Heichad bifnim have a haktara gemura, in a case where already they did the full haktara, the full rest of the haktara they already did inside the Beis HaMikdash. And then the Mishnah said, "V'kulan shechasru kolshu." In all of these cases, if something went missing, meaning kodem haktara, before anything was burned, let's say something went missing, it was lacking al yedei ibud, it was either destroyed, lost, osreif, or it was burned. So then nifsalu bechesronon. So chisaron is considered a disqualification in these cases. Kedam Rabbi Menachos, like we say Menachos, min ha-mincha, from the mincha, prat l'shechasra hi v'shechasra komza, that excludes when it's missing or when the kometz is missing. And Rashi continues and notes, V'hai v'chulan, when it says over here in the Mishnah v'chulan that in all of these cases, if it's chasr, that's a disqualification. Lav al lavona koi, we're going on everything but not going on lavona. That does not include the frankincense, because on that, the hamiflag pligiba, that's actually a machlokis, b'menachos b'perakam, in the first parak of menachos, b'lavona shechasra, let's say you have frankincense where some is missing, till Rabbi Shimon kasher, Rabbi Shimon says it's kosher, afilu amda al kord echad, even if only a small amount is left. Ul Rabbi Yehuda b'shnei kortin, Rabbi Yehuda says you have to have two small amounts left. V'i alavona nami koi. Now, if it is going on the lavon, on the frankincense, so mayri shechasra mishir hechsheira, it's going to have to be talking about a case where it's chasr, it's missing so much that you don't have the proper amount, the minimum amount that would be kosher. Lamar ked islay or lamar ked islay. Again, according to each Tana, what he holds is the minimum amount. And then the Mishnah said, v'ikrivo b'chutz potter. Again, if it was offered outside the Beis HaMikdash, the person is exempt, and that's going on a case where it already was disqualified because of chasr. Hoel vein miskablim bifnim, since in this case it wouldn't have been accepted inside the Beis HaMikdash. So again, it's a situation where it is disqualified. Therefore, if it's a kriva b'chutz, it's going to be potter. And finally, the Mishnah said, Hamalik kachim ve'emurein, if somebody offers of kachim and their sacrificial portions, shehikriv habasar v'heimurin, again offers the meat and the sacrificial portions, mechubarin bo, they're attached to it, chayiv is chayiv, mishum eimurin, he's going to be chayiv because of the sacrificial portions. And the idea over here is that since it's the emurin, since it's the sacrificial portions that are supposed to go on the mizbeach, it's upon those that there's liability for sacrificing it outside the Beis HaMikdash. And the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, the sages taught in the Braisa, Hamakter Kezayis, and the Shinui Neschos puts in the word Ketoras over here. Hamakter Kezayis Ketoras Bachutz. If somebody burns a Kezayis of the Ketoras, the incense, outside the Beis HaMikdash, so Chayiv, then he's liable. That part of the Braisa implies that a Kezayis is something that would be accepted inside the Beis HaMikdash. And Chatzi Pras Bifnim, if he is Makter, if he burns a half pras, which is not the full measure, because the full measure is a pras, so if he burns a half pras bifnim inside the Beis HaMikdash, so then potter, then he is exempt. And the Gemara says, Kasal Kadaitach, initially we think, my potter, what does the word potter mean over here, exempt? What Isser is being violated? What it means is potter zar. What it means is that if a non-Kohen does that, he's going to be exempt, because a non-Kohen is not supposed to do this avoda in the Beis HaMikdash. But the problem is, Amai, why would he be potter? Again, if we're saying that a kezayis is considered a significant acceptable amount as far as liability by chutz, that should also be a liability when a zar does it, because haktari, that's considered to be a haktara, it's considered to be a burning. And the Gemara continues, Amar Reb Zera, Amar Reb Chisda, Amar Reb Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rav. Reb Zera says that Reb Chisda says that Reb Yirmiyah bar Abba says that Rav says, my potter, what does the Braisa mean when it says exempt? It actually means potter tzibor. It actually means that the community is exempt, meaning that there's been a fulfillment of the obligation, because again, it does not need to be the full amount to fulfill the obligation. And the Gemara continues, Amar Reb Zera says, Ikashali, if anything is difficult to me, Hakashali, the following is difficult to me. Hadiyamar Rav Allah, that which Rav said on this Braisa, he said, Baha, that in this case, Afilu Rebbe Lazar Moda, even Rebbe Lazar would admit, meaning even Rebbe Lazar in our Mishnah, who generally requires the full amount, but here when it comes to the Ketores, the Kezayis would be sufficient for liability. But the problem is, Vaha Rebbe Lazar Lav Haktara he comer, but Rebbe Lazar says it's not a Haktara, so why is it that Rebbe Lazar would admit? What is Rav even saying over here? And Rashi explains, Chatzi Pras Bifnim, again the Braisa said a half pras inside the Beis HaMikdash, Lav Davka Chatzi Pras Nakat. When the Braisa says here a half a pras, it doesn't specifically mean exactly a half a pras. Duhu Adin La Kezayis, the same the Braisa could have said a Kezayis Bifnim. Elapachos Mikashir Hechsher Mitzvah Nakat. All the Braisa means is that it was less than the shear of the full mitzvah, and so again a half a pras, a Kezayis, the same basic idea. Rashi continues, Kasal Kadaitach, initially we think my potter, what does the Braisa mean when it says potter? Potter Zara means that the non-Kohen, if he does it, he's potter. The Ilav Bezaras Kamer, because if it's not talking about a non-Kohen, my potter Shayach Lamemer Bifnim, what is this exempt that we're talking about inside the Beis HaMikdash? My potter, why would he be potter? Ha-Haktari, that is a situation of burning. To Ha-Hai Tana de Mechayvel Abachutz, because again, this Tana said that it's significant enough to be liable outside the Beis HaMikdash, so then why should it be any different by a Zar? And the Gemara then said, my potter, what does it mean potter? In the Braisa, potter tzibor, it means that the tzibor is exempt, meaning the yotzu yedei chovas, and they fulfill their obligation. The kezayis have a haktara. Essentially, the Braisa is saying that a kezayis by the ketoris is considered to be a haktara. The Gemara says then that Rav said, B'ha afilu Rebbe Lazar moda, that even Rebbe Lazar admits in this case. V'afagav depolik b'masnisan abachutz. Now, even though in our Mishnah, Rebbe Lazar argues by bachutz, and he says that by ketoris. By the ketoris, he says that bachutz, it has to be the full amount. Modahu lahai tana, but he would admit to the tan of this Braisa, b'hai seifa, in this end of the Braisa, the potter tzibur, that again, less than the requisite amount by the ketores, the tzibur would be potter, meaning they have fulfilled their obligation. And so on that, v'kashali Allah, I have a kasha on that. Amai moda, why would he admit? For Rebbe Lazar lav haktara, he kamar mi the potter Allah b'chutz, because Rebbe Lazar clearly says that it's not haktara, because he does say in our Mishnah that b'chutz, that if it's done outside the mikdash, the person is exempt, and therefore if it's not a haktara, so why is it that we would say potter tzibur? Why is this a fulfillment of the tzibur's obligation? And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rabba says, B'haktara dehechol dekuli almalo pligi. When it comes to the haktar and the hechol, and that's a reference to the ketoris that we've been discussing, it actually is not a machlokis. Ki pligi, when is there a machlokis? B'haktara de pnim. We're talking about the haktara of pinim, and that's actually a reference to Yom Kippur, of lifnai v'lifnim in the Kodesh Kadoshim. That's actually the machlokis in the Mishnah. Meaning Rabba is suggesting that when Rebbe Lazar admits, he admits by the ketoris. And when does Rebbe Elazar argue by Ketoris in the Mishnah? That's talking about lifnai v'lifnim. And what's that machlokes? The Mar Savar Melochafnav Davka. One says it says Melochafnav, that the pasuk by Yom Kippur gives a shear of a handful. Umar Savar Melochafnav Lav Davka. And the other one says that it doesn't actually have to be a handful, meaning there's a machlokes whether the shear is necessary. But again, when it comes to the Ketores, so there is no machlokes. And Rashi explains, Amar Rabba says, B'haktorah dehechol shebechol yom. When it comes to the Ketores every day in the Beis Hamikdash, shelo nemar bo shir, it doesn't actually say in the pasuk a requisite minimum amount. V'hai pras shir derabbananu. And the pras, when we say it has to be a pras, that actually is a shir of the rabbanan. Again, a pras is a half a mana. So Moder Rebbe Elazar the bekazayis have a haktorah. So there Rebbe Elazar would admit that a kazayis is a haktorah. L'chayev alebachutz. And Rebbe Elazar would say, not like what he says in our Mishnah, he would say the person is liable outside the Beis HaMikdash. Ulahotzi tzibor yidei chovasim b'fnim, and for that amount, a kazayis would in fact fulfill the community's obligation. Umasnisin kula reisha v'seifa divrei hakolhi, and the brisa, the beginning and the end of the brisa is actually everybody. Rebbe Elazar is not only admitting in the seif of the brisa, he's admitting in the reisha as well. Uvahaktorah dehechol mayri, and again the brisa is talking about the ketores, and there Rebbe Elazar says that it's considered to be a haktorah even at a kazayis. And ki pligi b'masnisin, and what is the machlokas in the Mishnah when it talks about a machlokas by ketores? That's b'haktorah d'yom hakipurim d'lifnai v'lifnim. That's by the burning on Yom Kippur, which is inside the Kodesh Kadoshim. Shenemar bashir. There the pasuk does have an amount. And the pasuk says melochafnav, it says a handful. Dafka doesn't mean dafka. Ubebasachas. Now dafka means to say that it would all have to be at once. You have to burn it all at once. And so hilkach, therefore, bachutz nami lo mechayev ela shlema. Therefore, Rebbe Elazar would say that if it's done outside of the proper area, so then the person's only going to be chayev when it's the full amount. And again, the Rabbanan disagree, and they say melochafnav is lav dafka. That's Rabba's approach to understanding the machlokas in our Mishnah. But the Gemara continues. Amar le Abaya. Abaya says to him, he says to Rabba, v'hakika ksiva chuka. When is the word chuka written? Chuka indicates a requirement. B'haktara dipnim hu d'chsiv. It's written by the burning inside the Kodesh Kadashim. And Rashi explains the question, v'hakik ksiva chuka b'fnim ksiva k'dechsiv, as it's written in the pasuk v'isa zos lachem l'chukas olam l'chaper. We understand that pasuk to mean dvarim she'ein nasen ela achas b'shana. It's referring to something which happens only once a year, meaning this pasuk is referring to the burning of the Ketores on Yom Kippur. Chuka ikuvahu, and the word chuka indicates a requirement, and that would indicate that when it says melochafnav, that is a requirement on Yom Kippur. Here we're saying that's a machlokas tanoim. And the Gemara continues and answers, Elo Amar Abaya, rather Abaya says, B'haktara bifnim kuli alma lo pligi. There actually is not a machlokas by the burning of the ketores inside the Kodesh Kadashim, ki pligi, and when is there a machlokas b'haktara d'chutz? There's a machlokas by the burning outside. Mar savar yalfinan pnim michutz. One holds that we learn inside from outside. Umar Savar lo yalfin, and one says we do not learn. And Rashi explains Hachi Garcina, and this is the proper text. El Amar Abaya, rather Abaya says B'haktara dipnim to kuli alma lo pligi. Again, there's no machlokas by the burning inside of the Kodesh Kadashim. Ki pligi b'haktara d'chutz, and when is there a machlokas? That's by the burning outside. And Rashi explains Abaya nami kirava mitaris lo. The truth is that Abaya also is answering along the same lines as Rabba. De braisa demo de Rebbe Elazar, that the braisa which Rebbe Elazar agrees to, there he doesn't argue. B'haktara dehechol, that's talking about the haktara, that's talking about the burning in the heichal, meaning that's talking about the regular ketores that's each day. Umasnisin, in our Mishnah, where Rebbe Elazar does argue, b'haktara dipnim, that's talking about the burning inside the Kodesh Kadashim, and that really is what Abaya said. Again, the issue is that if there's a machlokas lifnai v'lifnim, if there's a machlokas in the Kodesh Kadashim, how could that be? Rabba said that it says the word chuka, and therefore everyone should agree that we say melochafnav is dafka. And Rashi continues and explains, umiu, now nevertheless, lo ketaima de Rabba. Abaya over here is not following the reason of Rabba. Diyomer l'Rabbanan melochafnav lav dafka, because again, Rabba said that according to the Rabbanan, melochafnav is lav dafka. That's how he understood the machlokes by lifnai v'lifnim. That's not the case. The kuli alma, that actually according to Abaya, everybody agrees melochafnav dafka. That when it says melochafnav, it means dafka, it means it has to be that amount. Ubifnim de kuli alma lo pligi, and what the Gemara means means is that inside the Kodesh Kodashim there's no machlokes, the shleima bo'inon. Everybody agrees that everybody agrees shleima is necessary. Everybody agrees that you really do need the full amount. Ki pligi, but when is there a machlokes? Kegon shehikter kezayis min haktores shel chafinas penim bachutz. The whole machlokes is, let's say you take a kezayis from the ketores, which was going to be inside the Kodesh Kodashim, and you do a kezayis of that outside the proper area. Mar savar yalfinon penim michutz. Now one holds that we learn inside from outside, meaning yalfinon ketores shel penim mi ketores shel heichel. We learn the ketores inside from the ketores of the heichel. Mahaktara shel heichel bebama bachutz bekezayis, just like the haktara, the burning of the heichel in a bama bachutz, that we say the shir is a kezayis. So af haktara shel penim chayovin ole bebama bekezayis. So too, when it comes to the lefnai v'lefnim ketores, one is chayiv even if it's a kezayis. Meaning to say that again, everybody agrees by the regular ketores of the heichel. Everybody agrees that a kezayis is considered to be a haktara. That is not a machlokes. Even Rebbe Lozer agrees to that. But the question just is, when it comes to the haktara, when it comes to the ketores lefnai v'lefnim, so do we learn that from the ketores of the heichel? Do we say that by the ketores lefnai v'lefnim, even though the real requisite shear has to be a full shear, but still maybe we learn liability bachutz from the ketores in the heichel? That's the whole machlokes. And again, the Rabbanan say we do learn that. That's the machlokes in the Mishnah. And Rebbe Lozer says no, it has to be the entire amount. Now, even though in the Kodesh Kodashim certainly less than the amount would not be a haktara. But since in the heichel that is considered to be a haktara, and that point everybody agrees on, so therefore there's a machlokes by penim. Rebbe Lozer says we don't learn penim from chutz, meaning haktara de heichel hu de mechayev Allah bachutz bekezayis. When it comes to the ketores of the heichel, so bachutz the person's chayev by kezayis to beduchta b'hachi chashiva, because that's also considered in its place. That's considered the right amount. But when it comes to lefnai v'lefnim, there one would not be liable outside the Beis HaMikdash by a kezayis, since that's not a haktara in its proper place. And so again, it emerges according to Abaya, essentially the same as Rabbah. The machlokes in the Mishnah is talking about haktaras penim, it's talking about lefnai v'lefnim, and everybody agrees by haktara dehechol, there certainly a kezayis is considered to be a haktara. But again, according to Abaya, the nature of the machlokes is different. The nature of the machlokes is simply whether we learn penim from chutz. Again, according to the Rabbanan, we learn penim from chutz, and therefore one is liable by chutz. Let's say it's a situation of lefnai v'lefnim. He takes that ketores of Yom Kippur and he burns it by chutz. There is going to be a liability, even though it's just a kezayis, because again, we learn it from the case of chutz. And again, Rebbe Lozer says we don't learn from there, and therefore, since you need the shear when it comes to the Kodesh Kodashim on Yom Kippur, you need that requisite shear to fulfill the obligation. That's the amount you need as well for liability when it is done by chutz. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, how can you say that the machlokas over here is whether we learn panim from chutz? Hashta chutz mi chutz lo yalfi. Even chutz from chutz we don't learn, as we're about to see. Lo yalfi rabbanon. The rabbanon don't learn chutz from chutz, so panim mi chutz mi boy. Are you going to say that we learn panim from chutz? How could you say that? And the Gemara says, Mahi, what exactly is Rava referencing? Clearly Rava is referencing something where we don't learn chutz from chutz. And the Gemara says, Tanya, as we learned in the following brisa, Yachol hamale pachos mi kazayis kometz. One might think if one offers up less than a kazayis of the kometz of a mincha, upachos mi kazayis emurin, or less than a kazayis of sacrificial portions, v'hamenasech pachos mi shloshes lugin yayin, somebody who pours a libation of less than 3 lug of wine, pachos mi gimel lugin mayim, less than 3 lug of water, yehei chayiv, one might think there's an obligation. Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says lasos, it says the word lasos, al hasholim chayiv, one is only liable if it's the whole amount. Again, this is talking about bachutz. Ve'eno chayiv al hachaser, one is not chayiv, one is not liable if it's less than the requisite amount. And so the Gemara now says, "V'hapachos mishloshes lugin." Now, when it comes to less than 3 lug, the isbuhu kama zaysim. So there you have several zaysim. In other words, you do have a kazayis. You have more than a kazayis in that situation, and so therefore there would be an argument to say that we should learn the liability from the case of a kazayis. But yet, v'lo yalfi rabbanon chutz mi chutz. Yet the rabbanon don't learn chutz from chutz. In other words, everybody agrees that in these cases, if it is a kazayis, there's a liability. liability. The Brisa is saying, pachos mikazayis, there's no liability, but by kazayis you would have liability. So maybe you should then say, again, learn chutz from chutz, and at least by the libations, as long as it's a kazayis, that should be enough. Apparently we don't learn chutz from chutz, and so therefore Rav is saying, how can it be that we learn panim from chutz? And the Gemara continues with Rava's approach. Elam our Rava, rather Rava says, the case in the Mishnah where Rebbe Lazar and the Rabbanan disagree is kagon, for example, the kavinu shnei chatzoi pras, where one designated 2 half pras for the ketoras. And Rashi explains, hashta chutz mi chutz, we don't learn outside from outside. Could go nisach hayayin, again, for example, as the Gemara brings the Brisa, by the libation of the wine, shu'ala mizbeach hachitzon, that's done in the outer mizbeach. Lo yalfi rabbanan mehekter chalavim shu'ala mizbeach hachitzon, lechayev al pachos mishlosha lugan bachutz. The rabbanan don't learn from the burning of chalev, which is also on the outer mizbeach, that a person should be chayev by the libation even less than 3 lug outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Aval b'sheyesham kama zeisim, even though there are several zeisim. V'gabei kol haktaro shal mizbeach hachitzon haktari. And when it comes to all the burnings on the mizbeach and the outer mizbeach, that should be enough. Hoel v'gabei nisach shiur achrinahu. But we don't say that, since by libations it's a different shear. Lo mechayev oleh ela b'kashir. The liability is only when it's the proper shear. And so if you're not learning chutz mi chutz, pnim mi chutz, lechayev al ketorah shel lefnai v'lefnim b'bama b'chutz, yalfinon me'aktar dehechel, we're going to learn that a person is liable by the ketoras of lefnai v'lefnim if he does it outside on a bama. We should learn that from the Heichal. And the Gemara then said, pachos mi kazayis kometz, again less than a kazayis of the kometz. Rashi says, al karchach rabbanan. Now this brisa clearly must be the rabbanan. De'i Rabbi Eliezer, because if we were following Rabbi Eliezer, afilu a kazayis lo mechayev. He would say even a kazayis is not enough to be chayev. To amar ad sheyakrev eskul, and he says you have to bring the whole amount. And Rashi continues, Elam Rava, rather Rava says, Kagon de Kavinu b'mona, the case by the Ketoras is where he designates it in a vessel, meaning Liola masnisinu Braisa b'haktar de Heichel. According to Rava, both our Mishnah and the Braisa are talking about the Ketoras of the Heichel, and have a Haktara b'duchta b'kezayis, and it's considered a Haktara even just with a Kezayis. Umishamachi katani lo b'Braisa chayiv, and that's why the Braisa says, liable by a Kezayis if it's done outside the Beis HaMikdash. V'Rebbe Lazar modeh b'ked Rav, and Rebbe Lazar also would agree to that, like Rav says. And so then the question is, what's the machlokas in the Mishnah, where Rav Elazar says it has to be the whole amount? Uplugsa de masnista, the machlokas in the Mishnah could go into kavish shnei chatzoi pras b'mana. The case is where he designates 2 half pras in a vessel, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kuf Yud Amud Aleph.